This is session number 23 of an introduction to worldviews and apologetics. And I'm Dr. John McMath, joined here by my friends in Italy and in the Philippines. We've been studying together ever since the COVID panic took over the world. And it looks like that's going to be a while yet. Today, we're going to move on into the questions related to a question that non-Christians asked: how reliable is the Bible? As usually framed much more aggressively. Just recently, I had a conversation with a young lady who'd been sharing her faith, and the person she was talking to says, "Oh, you can't trust anything in the Bible. It was translated so many times, nobody has any idea what's in it." Uh, and this is a person who quite obviously doesn't have a clue. Uh, and we'll find that lots and lots of people out in the general population really truly don't have a clue. They haven't studied these things, and so it's a little hard to blame them for not being aware of the technical details. We're going to look today at some technical details about um, uh, the original manuscripts of the New Testament, and we'll ask ourselves just how do we know that one, we have good copies of the original manuscripts, and how close are they to the actual writers? So, for instance, with the Quran, the Muslim holy book, the tradition has it that Muhammad wrote these things down, or actually recited them, and his followers supposedly wrote them down. But the oldest manuscript evidence we have for the Quran is roughly 800 years after the fact. And there are hidden copies of the Quran, copies that are not generally available and that are difficult for scholars to get their hands on, that demonstrate a very wide range of textual differences. So just on general principles, on the principles of analysis of historical documents, we would say that the Quran is not very reliable. It's far removed from the theoretical original events. It wasn't written down by eyewitnesses or disciples of eyewitnesses. It was written down much, much later. And because of that, we can't really say what Muhammad wrote. Matter of fact, it's even questionable that Muhammad, as described in the Quran, ever existed. But that's a whole different question. So the same kinds of historical questions can be asked about the New Testament. That's where we're going to go today. Last week we looked at the textual history and reliability of the Old Testament. We came to the conclusion that the Old Testament is so reliable. Uh, we are so certain that we have uh, a really, really good, not perfect, but really, really good copy of the text. The scholars simply don't argue about it anymore. I mean, the non-believers, of course, reject the Old Testament like they reject the New Testament. But scholars who are actually serious about the material have recognized that our Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament are extremely close to the original. And we have a very, very reliable set of historical documents there. Okay, in the New Testament, let's go ahead and get the share screen started. See if I can do this. Since last time, this is the one I want right over here. Since last time, Zoom has been updated, or at least I was forced finally to move over to an updated version of Zoom, and everything has changed, and I barely know how any of it works anymore. It's been a fun morning getting all of this together. The New Testament is really important for Christians. Obviously, I think it should go without saying. Nevertheless, it is really, really important for Christians. And in fact, the New Testament is what we build our case on. When we're making a case for the gospel, for the deity of Christ, for the resurrection, for salvation by grace through faith, we're building that on the New Testament. And we can rely on archaeology and secular historians for a bit of support on the outside. But the New Testament itself is extraordinarily important. So if we're going to figure out what did Jesus teach and what did the apostles actually teach, we're going to have to rely on the New Testament. We would do well to establish the authenticity of the New Testament. By authenticity, I mean we have to answer the question, are the documents that we have a reliable copy of the original eyewitness testimony of the New Testament writers? The New Testament claims to be written by Jewish converts of the first century who were eyewitnesses to the life and ministry of Christ and the establishment of the early church. If that's true, that's historians' gold strike. This is treasure. We have, for so many things, we have so little historical data. If you were going to study the 19th century Crimean War, for example, you'd be relying on a variety of newspaper accounts and a couple of official accounts from the British Foreign Office. The Russian troops who were involved kept almost no records. There were some Turkish troops involved who kept almost no records. So we have next to nothing from something as recent as the Crimean War. And yet nobody doubts that it happened or the general outline of the events. The same is true with many other historical characters. We often have very, very little. Everybody thinks they know that Muhammad lived and talked to angels and established a religion. But in fact, we have almost no substantive data to back that up. Everybody thinks they know about the Gautama the Buddha for Buddhism, yet the historical documentation is almost completely lacking. It's a wonderful tradition, but was there ever really a Gautama who was the Buddha? And the simple answer is we don't know. The tradition obviously exists. It probably refers to something, but we can't even put his life in the correct century. So what do we really know? Not nearly as much as we'd like. So what about the New Testament? The authenticity of the New Testament is a separate part of the whole apologetics project. And it can be quite technical. As you can see, just looking at this page, this is a papyrus document This particular one is from the Bodmer Papyrus. The Bodmer Library is in, oh my goodness, is in England. The other real big one that we'll be looking at today is called the Chester Beatty Papyrus Collection, and it's named after the Chester Beatty Library in Ireland, in Dublin, in Ireland. And often these things are named after their libraries, wherever they happen to be found. But this is a real important one, the Bodmer Papyrus Collection. Big chunks of the New Testament. There's something like 73 individual leaves of the Bodmer Papyrus Collection, and it includes most of the books of the New Testament, dates to the middle of the 2nd century. So this is really old. It's all the way back to the beginning. It is not, however, the oldest manuscript that we have. So let's look at the argument that we're going to make, and this we'll try to get through today. First, we're going to take a look at the range of the existing manuscript copies. When I say manuscript, I mean handwritten. These were written by scribes. And often in the Middle Ages, they were done in monasteries. And how many do we have? Where are they? How close are the texts that we have to the original text? How many differences are there, manuscript to manuscript? Okay, in this, we're interested in how many manuscripts we have, and we're interested in the historical spread. Do all of our manuscripts come from one particular century, or are they spread out? If there are early manuscript copies, how do they differ from the very late manuscript copies? Those are questions that scholars called textual critics deal with. And in the New Testament, this gets to be a large and controversial field. And it's a very interesting field to be in. I have never handled the original manuscripts. I've seen some of them from a distance, but I'm not a specialist in this. The specialists actually go out hunting for manuscripts, and it's amazing how many new, previously unknown manuscripts are uncovered every year. It's a fascinating thing. Then finally, the question of the dating of the original sources of the manuscripts. So let's say we get a manuscript from the 15th century, just before movable type was introduced. Where did it come from? Well, okay, it was copied in a monastery in Italy. Okay, Monte Cassino, let's say, which is entirely possible. And we know that it was copied along with 50 others, which were copied at the same time in a large scriptorium from an original whose date is about 300 years earlier. Okay, that's an interesting piece of information. We can get that kind of information on virtually every manuscript until we finally get all the way to the earliest manuscripts, the papyrus manuscripts, that are very likely copies of the apostolic originals. That's what we're after. That's where we're going. So we're going to look at the manuscript copies, count them up, and examine them by date. We're going to look at other manuscripts in secular history, and then we're going to see if we can put some dates on any of these. How reliable are those dates? Let's start off with the manuscripts themselves, and this is a couple of manuscripts. The one on the left is from an Irish scriptorium from a monastery, and it is, I believe, what's called a lectionary. A lectionary is a collection of readings for use in church. And it's New Testament, it's Gospels and the letters of Paul. And it's very nice. It dates to about the 12th century from Ireland. The Irish monks were some of the best of the scribes. They made beautiful, beautiful manuscripts. The manuscript on the right is also quite old. It's about 12th century. Comes from a scriptorium in France. Uh, they're very old. Okay. We can say that there is more and more abundant and accurate manuscript evidence for the New Testament than for any other book from the ancient world, by literally by orders of magnitude. We have roughly 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament from every era, going back to the first century. Uh, some of our oldest manuscripts include P52, papyrus number 52, discovered about 100 years ago in a trash heap in Egypt, and covers several verses in John chapter 18, and clearly belongs somewhere around 100 AD. It was probably written within 20 years of the death of John himself. So it's a very, very close run thing. P45, 46, and 47 were probably copied around 100 AD, maybe as late as 110. Dr. Comfort, who produced the definitive two-volume set of the papyrus manuscripts, argues that the the so-called Chester Beatty papyri date to as early as 80 AD. So 45, 46, and 47, roughly 120 manuscript pages include most of Paul and some of the Gospels, and they were put down on papyrus less than 50 years after the originals were put down. So this is very, very early indeed. The Bodmer Papyrus collection, around 200 AD. This is P66, 72, and 75. It includes Luke and John and some of the general epistles, the Johns, Peter, the Peters, and Jude. The big, wonderful, complete Bible that we call Vaticanus is abbreviated capital B in the footnotes, and it dates to about 325 AD. This is a complete Greek Bible, Old and New Testament, written on vellum, which is made from goat skin. It is very thin, very flexible. It's a absolutely wonderful material for putting manuscripts on. It's a codex, meaning it's in book form with pages instead of a long scroll. The papyrus was normally produced in scrolls, and the vellum manuscripts that we begin seeing in the 4th century are normally codex form. We know that during the reign of Constantine the Great, Constantine took over the world in 310 AD, and converted to Christianity and ordered that Christianity be treated as a legal religion. And in order to demonstrate his support, he not only paid for church buildings in some important places, he also ordered the production by professional scribes of 50 great Bibles. A great Bible being a Bible big enough for reading from the pulpit of the cathedral-sized buildings that Constantine was planning to build. We believe that 50 were produced. We're not sure what happened to all of them. Matter of fact, we're not absolutely sure about any of them. It's entirely possible that Vaticanus is one of those great Bibles. Another of the great Codex manuscripts is Sinaiticus, which has the abbreviation, the Hebrew letter Aleph, and it probably was written no later than 340 AD. Again, almost all of the Bible, and it's on vellum. And probably also one of Constantine's Bibles. There are also several other early codex editions. There are some 150 all told of the codex Bibles. And they date as early as 325 AD and as late as around 600 AD. After that, they turn into a different kind of material. Nothing else in ancient literature is even close. Let me see here. Okay, I've got a good list of what there is. The illustrated Bibles, what we call illuminated, come in all shapes and sizes. They're done all different kinds. All told, there are about 175 papyrus manuscripts, mostly fragments, from before the year 400 AD. After 400 AD, papyrus began to be used less and less until it finally disappeared entirely with the Muslim takeover of North Africa. The papyrus mostly came from Egypt and from the shores of the Middle East. But 175 papyrus manuscripts. More and more of the papyrus manuscripts continue to be found in excavations in Egypt and in the Middle East. When I was in seminary 50 years ago, there were about 80 papyrus manuscripts. Today we have access to 175, and that number continues to increase. I listened to a technical presentation by one of the scholars who's been working on a fragment from the Gospel of Mark. And this particular fragment came from the paper mache that surrounds a mummy sarcophagus. So when Egyptian noble people were mummified, their bodies were wrapped in first some layers of cloth and then a papyrus paper mache. You take the papyrus strips, get them wet, add glue both sides, and wrap the papyrus around the outside. And so it makes a hard, light material that's made up of layers and layers and layers of this papyrus material. Frequently, old manuscripts, which were not of interest to the people who had them, they were just scrap papyrus, are used to make these mummy cases. I always used to think that those were all made of wood. Most of them are not. Most of them are made of papyrus paper mache, multiple layers of papyrus documents, old papyrus scraps, wrapped layer upon layer upon layer to make up the mummy case. And modern scholars have learned how to uh, soak and disengage the layers of a mummy case. They're finding thousands of scraps, readable scraps of ancient papyrus. Most of those are not biblical, but a surprising number are coming out to be biblical. So at this particular seminar that I listened to, the scholar in charge had found a, a very large chunk of the Gospel of Mark. And it's extremely early based on the way the letters were formed. We know that it was copied by a professional scribe. It relates to all of uh, the very early conventions. Definitely written during the first century, probably 50 or 60 AD, according to this scholar. That has not been published yet. It's not included among the 175 that we have available. It has not been collated into the Markan literature for textual criticism, but it will be. And it's very, very, very old. We keep finding those things. Secondly, the uncials are manuscripts written in capital letters, all caps, which is that's hard to read. But it was the way the professional scribes did very important documents. And our uncial manuscripts, we are number about 250. And these date from the year 300 for our earliest, which of course is Vaticanus, about 325, out to about 1000 AD. And these were typically great Bibles for reading from big churches. In addition to that, dating from around 500 AD all the way down to the end of the manuscript era, around 1400 AD, we have over 2,669. I think the number is quite a little higher by now because of work done by Daniel Wallace in the last decade or so. Dan Wallace is one of the professors of New Testament at Dallas Seminary in Texas, here in the U.S. And he takes students with him to the Middle East every summer. And they've gone to places like Mount Athos in Greece. They've gone to Patmos, the island where John was exiled. They've gone to Turkey, places near Ephesus primarily. They've been in Egypt. And the students will sift through piles of old manuscript evidence to see if there is anything that has to do with the New Testament. What an adventure for those youngsters. And all that they can learn just by reading those things. I would honestly, truly love to be young enough to go off on an expedition like that. So the minuscule manuscripts are written in small letters. These were a very, very common Bible. And again, during these years, from 500 to around 1400, up to the time of the Reformation, Bibles were not printed. They were handwritten and they were quite expensive. So typically, there would be a Bible in a church. So if a town had a sizable church, perhaps with a bishop, there would be a Bible there. And the priest would read from the Bible. This was a big deal. We also have at least 2,000 of what is called lectionaries. These were collections of readings for church. And they date from as early as 500 to as late as 1500 or so AD, and they're everywhere. We don't know how many exactly there are, but we have literally thousands of them, and nothing else in ancient literature is even close. I'll show you a chart here in just a few minutes so that you get some idea of just what the difference is. But first, I want to make a note about papyrus. And I may have said this before, I'll say it again, that papyrus is not the fragile, cheap, throwaway material that we once believed it was. When I was in grad school 50 years ago, the common notion was that papyrus was only used in the very beginning by amateur scribes trying to make quick copies of the original apostolic literature. And they were not good, and they were not designed to last. They began rotting immediately. Turns out that that's not true. Modern studies have demonstrated that papyrus was a high-end luxury item. It was cheaper than vellum, but it was still expensive. It was available from North Africa. Papyrus was a long-lasting material, as long as it was kept in a relatively dry environment. The church switched over to vellum leather primarily because of the elimination of papyrus by the fall of the eastern part of the Roman Empire to the Muslims. From 640 AD on, North Africa was no longer accessible from Europe, and things began to come apart. Papyrus, which comes from the Middle East, was cut off. We just didn't have any more. The papyrus manuscripts, as we know today from a careful study of the manuscripts that we actually have, were mostly produced by professional scribes. They were hired by Christians. Now, over time, there were some scribes who apparently also were Christian. We can see that by some of the notes they make in the margins. But most of the time, the scribes, up until about 500 AD, were not Christian. They were professionals, and they earned their living by doing good copies. A scribe who made a lot of mistakes was quickly going to find himself out of work. In the Old Testament, if a Jewish scribe made a mistake in his manuscript, and that mistake was discovered, the addition of a single letter in a manuscript of the entire Torah would lead to the manuscript being discarded, not thrown away, but put in a genizah, a storage room off to one side. There's very good evidence that Christian scribes operated to the same level of precision. The papyrus manuscripts that we see are very well written. They're neat, they're clean, they're well ordered. There are lines for the letters to be on. The letters are all the same size. The quality of the work is extremely good. So that's something that we know today that we didn't know 50 years ago. The other element has to do with the longevity of papyrus. As I said, we have about 175 papyrus manuscripts dating to prior to 400 AD. So they've lasted at least 1,500 years. Now that's under ideal conditions, very dry conditions, mostly in Egypt. But we find papyrus manuscripts in very good conditions of preservation after all this time. One of the really important notes that we have is a document from Ephesus that dates to about 500 AD. And this particular document happens to be written on vellum, but it doesn't matter. This is the facade, the front porch area of the library in Ephesus. Now, this is this place in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, where Paul planted the church. It was one of the great churches and was considered one of the great academic centers of the ancient world. One of the three great libraries of the ancient world was this one right here. This library and the church that it related to right across the street claimed that a collection of most of Paul's original letters existed here in Ephesus at 500 AD, and that these letters were available for examination by professional scribes who wanted to check their work. Fascinating. What this means is that it's very likely that all of the originals of the New Testament lasted a long time and were copied multiple times. Sometimes people say, "Oh, well, you can't trust the Bible because it's been copied so many times," like a game of telephone, where I start off with some statement, I whisper it in my neighbor's ear, and he whispers it in the next person's ear, and they whisper it into somebody else's ear, and it finally gets around the room, and it's completely unrecognizable. If you've never played that game, you can. It's kind of fun. And we used to say that that's what happened to the New Testament, but it turns out that's not true. Professional scribes could actually travel to places where there were either original or very old manuscripts of New Testament books, and they could compare their work to very close to the original. This is one of the ways that the accuracy of the New Testament was assured. So it's very, very likely that the originals lasted a long, long time, certainly many centuries. 5 centuries is not unlikely, and that the copies that we have, especially the older copies, were copied from the originals. Not at all unlikely. This is a comparison of New Testament manuscripts with other ancient secular history. So, for example, we have the writings of Julius Caesar, written around 100 BC. We have a grand total in all the libraries of the world of 10 copies of Caesar's histories. Julius Caesar's histories. Our earliest copy, and it's a treasure indeed, it's a wonderful thing, written in Latin, dates to 900 AD. The 10 copies that we have not been produced in a scholarly critical edition uh, for the simple reason that they're very, very different from one another. Uh, they're not close enough to one another as far as the differences of the readings that we can even assign an accuracy number to them. There aren't enough. We just don't have them. Nevertheless, when young classical scholars begin studying Caesar's Gallic War, for example, they don't worry about the text. They know that they're getting something reasonably good that is first person. Tacitus is a Roman historian. He lived after the time of Christ, and actually has some very interesting things to say about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and other things from that period. Most of his writing is somewhere right around 100 AD. Our earliest copy of Tacitus is 1100 AD. We have a grand total of 20 copies, most of them quite a lot later. And again, we can't assess the accuracy. Herodotus is a Greek historian, really, really important for the study of ancient history. We couldn't do ancient history without Herodotus. We have a grand total of 8 copies of Herodotus, dating to about 900 AD. The same is true with Thucydides, another of the ancient uh, historians. Homer, the poet, wrote around 900 BC. We really can't put a date to our earliest copy, but it's quite late. The number of copies that we have of Homer is about 643. These are found in libraries in various parts of the world. So we've got lots and lots of Homer. We've got enough copies of Homer that we can actually compare the copies to one another. And we discover that Homer has an accuracy of about 95%. My guess would be that that would be fairly standard for ancient literature. We don't have anything else even remotely as widely copied as Homer until we get to the New Testament. The New Testament was written between 50 and 100 AD. Our earliest copy, if the Chester Beatty is as early as 80 AD, it comes in that spread. Our earliest copies were probably made within 40 or 50 years of the death of the original writers. And in total, we have over 5,000 manuscripts, most of them quite late, but many of them, a large number of them, within just a century or less of the original writing of the New Testament. When we compare the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, as far as the whether the reading is the same or different, we find that there is a 99+% agreement between all of these 5,000 manuscripts. That's phenomenal. Just a few notes here. No other work of antiquity is anywhere close to the New Testament. Most ancient authors survive on just a few fragments, and scholars don't argue about their legitimacy. When ignorant people argue that the New Testament can't be legitimate because it's been copied, they obviously don't know what they're talking about. And I agree that this is fairly technical, but if they don't even know this, their ignorance is profound, and they really don't deserve to be listened to any further. The average gap between the original writing and the first available copy of other ancient stuff is 1,000 years or so. The New Testament has manuscripts written within a decade or two of the original writing. The copies were being made when the first disciples of the apostles were still alive and could contest an error. The New Testament has an accuracy of very close to 100%. Most other documents lack enough manuscript to even start to assess it. Compared to any other ancient document, religious or otherwise, the records of the New Testament are far more abundant, clearly more ancient and considerably more accurate in their text. It's just exactly the way it is. I'm going to give you an example here, and I know this is going to get technical, but I'm going to give you an example of a textual critical problem. This is one that I had to do just a couple of weeks ago, and I've known about this and have always taken a position on it, but I decided to go back to our original sources. And let me see if I can get my annotation pen. Okay. I'm looking here. Okay. Spotlight, draw. Okay, I can draw lines. Okay, we're going to do just a little bit of, yeah. Okay. Let me show you what's going on here. I've got four different modern English, oh, well, King James isn't real modern, but four different translations into English of Paul's verse in Romans. This is Romans 8:28. And the King James says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are who are the called according to his purpose. Okay, that's a well-known and very nicely translated passage. Let's see if I can get this to work. Nope, it's not gonna do it for me. Okay, let's back it up. Let's look at the phrase, all things work together for good. Okay, in that little phrase is the core, that's the sentence. We know is the introductory, that all things work together. Okay, all things is the subject, and work together is the verb. We would expect that all things would be in the nominative case. That's what a noun in the acting as a subject would do. Work together is another Greek verb, and it ought to be a present active plural. Is a third person plural verb. That's what it should be. Okay. And that's clearly what King James is translating. The ESV, English Standard Version, is a very modern, and that's a version that I often use. And it translates it this way. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. Okay. Well, just look at that one phrase again. ESV is also translating all things as the subject and work together as the main verb. And again, that should be a nominative, all things, and a plural verb. New American Standard Version, which is translated about 50 years ago, says it this way, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and are the called according to his purpose. Okay, here we have a difference. God is the subject. And it's interesting, it's translated, God causes all things to work together. Okay, so there we're looking for the main verb has to be cause, and all things will be the object of that verb, and to work together is a kind of infinitive. And I'm sorry for all the technical language, but the grammar is important. NIV, New International Version, another modern English translation, says, we know that in all things, God works for the good. Okay, so here we've got a prepositional phrase, in all things, tells us where God works. We know that God works in all things. And so we would expect to find all things in the so-called dative case. And we're going to be looking at both NASV and NIV. We're going to be looking for God as the subject. Now, the real big question is what happened to God in the King James Version and in the ESV. God is not the subject of the sentence in KJV and ESV. Rather, all things is the subject. So do we have a textual problem here, or do we have a translation problem? And the fact is, we have a textual problem. I'm going to show you now the text of the Greek New Testament itself. I know this is hard. You don't read Greek, but I do, and I'm going to show you what's going on here. If I could figure out how to use my my spotlight or something. Who can see what you share? Recording on. All right. All right. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do this. Can I? No. Okay. This is Nestle Allen 28. Oidemen, we know, yeah, and we know that to those who love God, panta sunerge. Ooh, how interesting. Panta is in the accusative case, right above the Na28, panta, pi alpha nun tau alpha. And the next word is sun erge, work together. And it happens to be in the third person singular present active verbal case. It's the verb of the sentence. And we would translate this all by itself. He works all things. Okay. And it's kind of odd because the he normally would take a subject. And it's assumed that theon, God, has got to be the subject, but it can't be. That word is in the accusative case and is the object of agaposin, to love. So we know that for those who love God, that phrase works very well. But panta sunerge, we're wondering who's the antecedent? Who is it that works all things? Whatever, he works all things for good. That is, to those who are the called according to purpose, prothesin. Okay, very interesting verse. Now you'll notice there's some squiggles in that NA28 text. In any of our New Testament texts, we're going to have footnotes, a little upside down L shape and a little upside down T shape and a little upside down T with a dot. Okay, the upside down T is going to take us to a footnote on the bottom of the page. And when we look at the footnotes at the bottom of the page of the New Testament manuscript, we find that this particular verse is found in P46, the Chester Beatty papyrus of the book of Romans. And this is the reading that we find in the Chester Beatty papyrus. Oidemende hoti tois, which is exactly what we have in the NA28. Agaposin ton theon, okay, agaposin ton theon, same exact thing, but now it goes pan sunerge hotheos. Wait a minute. Pan is in the accusative case. It's an object. Sunerge is exactly what we have in our NA28. All of our manuscripts agree on that. But the phrase ha theos, God, in the nominative is added here. If we translate this, it's going to come out, God works all things for the good of those who are the called according to his purpose. That last part is exactly the same. The addition here of the word God in the nominative case, making this the subject of this little sentence, makes sense of what we found up above in the NIV and in the NASV. That's what our two different sets of translators were looking at. The King James translators did not have access to the papyrus. They never knew. The English Standard Version apparently decided to follow the tradition of the King James Version. New American Standard and NIV both had access to P46, and they knew, just like the ESV writers did, that P46 is a very old manuscript and is copied within just a few years of Paul's death. So it's very likely on both internal and external grounds that P46 has the correct reading. We also find this in Sinaiticus. The P46 and Sinaiticus are quite distantly related. They're at opposite sides of the Mediterranean. They probably were both copied from the original of Paul's manuscript. The other manuscripts, and the majority of manuscripts, actually have the reading that we see in NA28. But the oldest, and I would argue the best manuscripts, have what we find in P46. So when I translate Romans 8:28, I read, and God works all things together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose, because of the textual problem. This is technically how we actually do it. This is the actual leaf of the Chester Beatty Papyrus 46 for that portion of Romans 8. The oidomen that starts the verse is in the third line from the top on the right hand side. The last couple of words are the beginning of that. This is written on papyrus. When we look at the way it's laid out, the shape of the letters, we can tell that this was written by a professional scribe. It's a very high quality work. Paleography is arguments for the shape of the letters, the way the letters are written, compared to other manuscripts written at the same time. And on paleographic bases, our scholar Comfort argues for a date between 80 and 90 AD. And having read the whole argument, I think he's right. There's a whole corpus, a whole body, a whole batch of Paul's epistles that was circulating and was being copied by professional scribes in central Egypt by around 80 AD, some 20 years after Paul's death. That's amazing. This is an amazing bit of data that suggests that all of the New Testament was being copied by professionals very early, certainly within the first century. So let's talk about dating the originals. William Albright, who's the father of biblical archaeology, tells us that every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the first century AD. Now, William Albright is no kind of Christian gentleman. He's probably an atheist, but he recognized that this is the way it actually was. The problem for the critics is that the critics have argued that the New Testament was created by some slow dialectic process, some argumentative process, that there were dozens of different early Christianities and different writers were putting together different versions of the Gospels or of the Acts or whatever. So there was a party of Paul who was into reaching the Gentiles. There was a party of Peter who was a Jewish partisan. Then in the next century, sometime very late, there was a party of John. Of course, long after John would have been dead, who pushed a synthesis of these two unrelated ideas. And the New Testament didn't settle into a form until the late second century. And along the way, there were lots and lots of competing religious ideas, any one of which could have been included in the mix. Okay, that's the critical point. This opinion, which is widespread and still taught in universities worldwide, is no longer reasonable in view of the hard evidence that, for example, John's gospel belongs to the first century. No question of that. It's worth looking at the evidence for the dates of these individual New Testament documents. Let's start with Paul's writing. The outline of the gospel story, as we trace it in Paul, agrees with the outline that we find in the New Testament, especially in the four gospels. Paul was martyred in 67 AD. His epistles were completed before his imprisonment in Rome, sometime between 60 and 62 AD. The latest of any of Paul, the prison epistles, shouldn't be dated later than about 62 AD. Even the Tübingen school accepts some of Paul's writings, and their arguments about at least six others are trivial. There've got to be 10 genuine epistles of Paul. Our New Testaments have 16, and I think that's likely. But even Tübingen would say 10. Every major point in the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Christ are described by a contemporary of the eyewitnesses. Paul was on hand. He is he is not an eyewitness, but he's an interviewer, a contemporary, a companion of eyewitnesses. This is primary source material for anybody trying to do history. Paul knew the apostles personally. He mentions his interaction with them specifically. His teaching is consistent with the apostolic teaching. Paul wrote within 30 years of the events themselves. That's not even close to enough time for the sort of distortions that the critical dialectic would have required. Paul challenged his readers to check his story with eyewitnesses who were still alive. So just on general principles, here we have a first-person eyewitness contemporary account that says, go check with eyewitnesses. The date is obvious. And Paul's stuff is obviously to be trusted. The Gospel of John is often attacked because it is so theologically profound. The Gospel of John teaches the deity of Christ more than any of the others. They all assume the deity of Christ, but John really lays it on thick. And the critics have said, well, Jesus could not possibly have become God in the mythology of the church for hundreds of years. So John has to have been very late. The Gospel of John itself claims to have been written by the disciple that Jesus loved, the one who lay on his bosom at the Last Supper. And here we have Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. We always wonder how come these guys all decided to sit on the same side of the table. Which one is John? Probably in green on Jesus' left side, or perhaps on the one in red on his right side. Hard to know. Peter is the bearded one on the left side here. Interesting stuff. So John was there at the Last Supper. He was one of the three, Peter, James, and John. James was killed early in the persecutions around 40 AD. Peter is particularly specifically named in the third person in the gospel. So John is the only possibility if we just look at the gospel itself. External evidence confirms that John is the author. The John Rylands papyrus, P52, plainly puts the writing of the gospel in the latter part of the first century. The John Rylands papyrus dates to around 100 to 120 AD. The original has to have been in the first century, not the second or third century, as the critics argue. The early church fathers, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, are three important characters who agree that John, the apostle, wrote the Gospel of John. Irenaeus is particularly important since he is just one generation removed from John. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp was a disciple of John while he was at Ephesus. There's an obscure statement by a church father named Papias in the 3rd century who suggests that there were two Johns. And it's a little hard to figure out what he's talking about, but it's actually irrelevant. There may well have been two Johns in the early church. John at that time was a very common name. So the external evidence for John's authorship, very strong. There's no question about it. Only John fits the process of elimination. This photo in the background is at Ephesus again, and this is the so-called Church of St. John. And John didn't build that church. It dates to the 4th century, but it's still, this is the traditional place where John lived out his life and had his ministry. The author of the Gospel of John was obviously an eyewitness. When you read the Gospel of John, you're reading a first-person account, an eyewitness account. The author was obviously a Jew, familiar with Jewish customs for purification, for burial, for feasts, attitudes of Jews. The author obviously was also Palestinian. He lived in Israel. He was familiar with the geography, the topography of Israel. Most honest scholars recognize that this is what we call a Johannine tradition, which is independent of the Synoptic Gospels, and it stems from Palestine, dates to 30 to 60 AD. There's no question about that. How about the Synoptics? These are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're all built on the same general outline and are probably related somehow. Scholars have long thought that Mark was the earliest, with Luke and Matthew adding some of their own material. Some argue that Matthew is the earliest. I actually really like the argument for that. That conversation, though, continues, and scholars continue to throw out bits of evidence for one position or the other. It really doesn't matter. They're all fairly early. Luke is the determining factor. Luke is the character in the middle here. Luke is the determining factor. His gospel was written before his history of the church, the book of Acts, because in Acts he refers to my previous history when I told you all of these things that have happened among us, and others have written numerous versions. So I decided it may be a good idea to flesh out the history of the church. Luke is written before Acts. The book of Acts ends with Paul in prison in Rome, the first imprisonment in 60 through 62 AD. If it had been written later, Luke would have mentioned Paul's death. There's no question about that. Luke was a fanboy of Paul. The gospel had to have been written earlier. Most agree between 50 and 60 AD. Gospel of Luke had to have been written between 50 and 60 AD, within 20 to 30 years of the original events. Mark has to be dated before that if Mark comes before Luke. And we think probably so, because Luke seems to rely on Mark for some things. Matthew has to fit in there somewhere. Mark was alongside Paul on the first journey, and then he was with Barnabas before he joined Peter. And Mark got his gospel material from Peter, who by that time would have been in Rome. And that would put Mark in the early 50s at the earliest. So Mark probably early 50s, Luke probably also early 50s. Matthew has to fit in there somewhere. They were independent, they were in different places, but they seem all to have worked from some of the same sources and some individual sources. None of these copied one another. So what we have here are three independent eyewitnesses, or in Luke's case, depending on an eyewitness, or in Mark's case, an eyewitness who is carrying Peter's history for him. We're looking at eyewitness accounts within 10 or 20 years of the original events that cannot be dated any later than this. The critics are simply wrong. They just don't know. So what's the bottom line? We have 5 authentic sources for the life of Christ. We know that Paul wrote his epistles between 50 and 60, including all of the essential teachings of Christ. Luke, who's a companion of Paul, had eyewitness accounts and written documents. Mark was on the fringe of the apostolic band during the life of Christ. He was there, but he went on to become a close associate of Peter. He writes from Peter's viewpoint around 50. Matthew was an eyewitness and provides a unique addition to both Mark and Luke. John uses independent sources of his own. He was an insider in the apostolic band. His sources can be dated to between 30 and 60 AD. Composition may have happened at Patmos after 80 AD, but the eyewitness accounts are very early. That means the New Testament records are authentic, first century, and first-hand information about the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Christ. Any way you look at it, the New Testament is a historian's gold mine. I'm going to stop the share, and I think we're going to quit here. And we'll get back to, let's see if I can make this go away. There I am. Oh, no, don't want to do that. Don't want to start multitasking. There we go. What I want to happen is for this to disappear. It's always such a pleasure when stuff just works. And when it doesn't, that can be a bit of a pain. Okay, here we are. So we're dealing with a New Testament that is remarkably well preserved and is clearly the work of eyewitnesses to the events themselves. An honest historian will agree that what we've got here is extraordinarily valuable material. So I think the upshot of that is the critics who say that we can't trust the New Testament are not honest historians. They have access to the same material that I have access to, and they're simply ignoring it. Uh, if you ever run into somebody who says, "Oh, well, you can't trust the New Testament. It was obviously copied and translated so many times. It's obviously not right," tell them you listen to a lecture by a professor of Bible who has actually handled the New Testament documents, and that the New Testament is more reliable than anything else out of ancient history, written by eyewitnesses from exactly the right time. The New Testament is historically reliable material. And there it is. I'm going to unmute everybody, and we're going to have to say goodbye. But we'll come back next time and look at the trustworthiness of the New Testament authors themselves. We'll look at, what kind of men these were. Were they the sort of men who would voluntarily falsify documents? Would they lie to protect their resources? Were they treasure hunters who were trying to make a quick buck by inventing a new religion for the peasants to follow? Or were they what they claimed to be, the initial followers of the Son of God, who made himself known to them in ways that were so remarkable that they couldn't deny it anymore? That's where we're going. And we'll be back next Wednesday and finish up this segment. Thanks for your patience. You guys are great fun. I love you all. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank
Oscar.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jogo.
Dr. John.
Deborah, I
Ciao,
think has
tutti.
gone away.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye, guys. Love you
Wow.
all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Oscar, I think the box with computers in it ought to be arriving in a week or two. I believe it's on a slow boat, but that the journey to Manila from Los Angeles ought to be about a week and a half. So let's see how it does. God bless.
Okay. Bye, Dr. John. Thank you.
Bye-bye.